I'm Alan Penn, and I'm Professor of Architectural and Urban Computing here at the Bartlett at UCL and Dean of Faculty. Is blockchain here to stay? Well, I think distributed ledger technologies are here to stay. The specific variants, I'm sure, will grow and change over time. Blockchain is currently a major one of them. At the moment, it's in financial services of various sorts, especially in Bitcoin and the cyber currencies. I think distributed ledger technologies are set to affect almost every area of life because what they provide is, if you like, a pretty difficult to corrupt history of transactions of what's taken place. And that allows automation of various things. It allows trust to be built and so forth. So I think they have a fundamental effect on many different areas of life. The timeline about distributed ledger technologies getting into circulation in the construction sector, in infrastructure, in cities, is actually something that's going to move at different paces for different purposes. My guess is that there will be certain functions which will be relatively early adopters, and then there are other things which are much more complex, which may take longer. It will be the simpler to implement, relatively straightforward cases that will get going first. And I would expect in the next 5 years that you'll see these coming along and changing practice. By the time we get to whole city infrastructure, this is big and complex, and that will take decades probably to really roll through the whole system. So some of the simplest use cases turn around provenance. So the provenance of products, being able to certify that something actually is what it says it is on the tin. This is incredibly important. We see manufacturing now making there's a global network of products and components which go into any building or any piece of infrastructure. And knowing where something has come from and it is actually manufactured to the standards that are specified has become remarkably difficult for anybody to be able to certify. So I think that's an area that will be a rapid take-up. The second area that I see very rapidly will move is actually about individual certification. So certification that individuals have the education and training that they say they have on their CV. This is important for health and safety on building sites. Are you certified to operate a particular piece of plant? It's important from the point of view of your skills training in terms of construction crafts and methods and so forth. And I think that that's a second area which will be relatively simple to implement, but will be an early adopter and will be transformational actually in how the sector works. So, an example of where I see the future leading comes out of the recent disaster at Grenfell Tower. If you look at what the inspector following that catastrophe has had to do, the first thing they've had to do is to bring together all the information about what in fact happened, what was the case. There was a refurbishment project which was cladding the building, and they had obtained building regulations permission for something. They were using components which had a level of certification, the cladding panels, but actually who knew what exactly was happening? It becomes a really difficult question as soon as you unpack it. There were building inspectors who had signed things off. There were contractors who had signed things off. There were craftsmen who had signed things off. There were clients who had signed things off, and there were insurers, all of whom had signed things off and taken responsibility. And yet, there was a massive disaster. So, to unpack what had actually happened would have been so much easier in a post-distributed ledger technology BIM world where everything would have been noted and you would have known who had specified what and who had signed what off at what stage. So in the future, I think that network of provenance, of checking, of certification is something which will be transformational to the culture. And that's actually the key point, because what it means is that people will have nowhere to hide. So you won't be able to just do a slapdash job in the hope that you can always point the finger at somebody else and blame them for it. You'll actually have to do the job right, because you know that if you don't, there's a very simple method of finding out exactly who is responsible. And that cultural change is something which I think is long overdue in the construction industry. So I think the potential for new use cases for distributed ledger technologies sit in all sorts of ways. Buildings are full of systems today, and those systems are created out of components, and those components are subject to all sorts of interactions. So when you put together a mechanical ventilation system, there are likely to be units and air handlers and dampers and ducts and wiring systems and control panels, all from many different suppliers. These need to be integrated into a single operating system, and one that can be taken through a commissioning process to prove that it works. Each of them are installed by different subcontractors very often, and the responsibilities across those contractual boundaries for ensuring that they perform to specification when there are system-wide effects in how things perform is complex. And this is one of the reasons why commissioning of these sorts of systems takes so long, and is very often the part of a project which overruns and leads to delays and so forth. Now, I believe that one of the really interesting things that will come from a distributed ledger provenance system is going to be that we're going to gather data that will allow us to understand the complexities of the interactions in these systems and to learn from them, so that I can imagine an integration between data that come from a distributed ledger and machine learning processes to begin to understand the integration issues and how those system-wide effects might happen that may lead us to actually be able to design and specify them better in the first place, and avoid some of the misfits, if you like, in these systems. Okay, it's actually really hard to assess which are the more mature and which are the less mature. Those that are coming from existing financial services sector issues are more mature in general terms. So the notion of smart contracts on financial transactions, these are implemented in other areas, and they can be implemented in our area, I think, in a relatively straightforward way. They're sort of known problems, if you like. The integration with other systems, which can be very large and complex, like building information models, BIM, is much less mature. And it is an area in which there's progress taking place. A lot of the manufacturers, the CAD vendors, are interested in making this happen, so Autodesk and so forth. So there's a lot of resource being pumped into it. But I would say that it's at a less mature stage conceptually. I think that some of the other use cases I've talked about are really not even on the starting blocks. They're just ideas in the mind, and will appear in time. I think the main challenges to implementing distributed ledger technologies in the built environment are going to be institutional and cultural. And actually they will depend on the degree of understanding by finance directors and board members of large companies of the nature of what blockchain technologies might be. That's assisted by the fact that these are taking place in other parts of the the financial services sector and so forth, and so there's a bit of credibility that comes from that. But the maturity of many construction sector companies in understanding at board level of technologies is perhaps not quite so high as it may be in the banking sector. I think blockchain is going to affect the way we work, because what it essentially does is shine a light on individual responsibility. So one way of thinking about this is that it's the equivalent of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon building, where the all-seeing guard at the centre meant that the workers or the prisoners at the periphery all behaved each other because they might be being looked at. This is what blockchain does. It opens up the ability for somebody to see exactly who took responsibility for what at any stage in a project. And that means that we'll move from a culture of litigation after the fact in construction to a culture of trying to get it right in the first place, and to holding one's hand up when one gets it wrong, because you might as well do that sooner rather than later. It's going to be absolutely visible at the end of the day. That cultural change is something which is being looked for in construction, for the last 50 years at least, with numerous government reports, and Latham and Egan and so forth, looking for that kind of cultural change. And I think this technology may be the tipping point, actually, in making it happen. I mean, every technology comes with risks, and amongst the risks here are that we will develop systems in which there's such a load on integration of information across the whole system that if something falls apart, the whole thing collapses. I don't think this is an insurmountable risk. I think it's a risk which there's not necessarily any reason why this is a particularly data-heavy risk, because of the hashing process by which you don't store the document itself, you store the hash to it. But there are always risks in systems in which humans are involved, of people trying to fiddle the system, and that itself causing problems. So I can imagine there being kinds of risk in a blockchain-enabled BIM system that will come from people making an error and then trying to cover their tracks by destroying some element of the chain of implication, which then might have effects further down the line. It will probably be through misuse by people rather than anything else that the risks sit.